Hi everyone, welcome to the first lecture video for juvenile justice. So very simply, those of you who've had me before know that my lecture videos are pretty straightforward. I cover the important content that you need to know, and yeah, I will say for those of you who've had me in person, you know that I write a lot on the blackboard. But those of you who've had me for online, I always do a PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint presentation has all the relevant, important notes for you. I just try to flesh out this information and explain it in simpler terms, sometimes giving different examples, that sort of thing. So that being said, welcome to our first lecture for Intro to Juvenile Justice. Well, Juvenile Justice is a class, and our first lecture is Intro to Juvenile Justice. So we're going to do an overview of the whole of juvenile justice. We're going to talk about some important things. And before we start anything, I'm telling you something right now that's definitely going to show up on an exam. The primary focus and goal of juvenile justice is to rehabilitate, not to punish. All right. Anyone that actually pays attention and listens will know that that's going to be an important question later. But, yeah, that's me having fun. Okay, so let's talk about the history of criminal justice. Well, not criminal justice. Let's talk about the history of juvenile justice, because that's a little more on brand and appropriate. So we do need to talk about that before the 19th century, there was no formal juvenile justice system. So for those of you who aren't quite sure, the 19th century is the 1800s. So before the 1800s, so 1799 and down, there was not a formal juvenile justice system. We had justice systems, we had policing, but we didn't have something designated for kids, okay? And so really at this time in history, before that 19th century, we had families and communities that were responsible for caring for individuals within it, especially those who are younger. What we refer to this as is kin policing. Those of you who've had intro to criminal justice will know that the earliest forms of policing that we have in our own human history is kin policing. And kin policing literally is the families and the local communities were in charge of punishment and corrections and whatnot for individuals who broke the rules. So pre-19th century, we may have started to have real formal judges and criminal justice systems, but we didn't have them for kids, for people under the legal age to be an adult, which definitely wasn't always 18, but that gets complicated. We're not diving into that. So specifically at this time, the focus was on corrective actions like community service or apprenticeships, and that goal was to teach proper behavior. Because this was an individualized by family and community, there was no oversight. There was no formal group. So this thing really was unregulated, which, like it or hate it, means that it didn't always work. So please note, I say focus on creative actions to, and I put in quotes, teach proper behavior, because some of these things were brutal. They were, hitting, beating, heavy manual labor jobs meant to punish, not necessarily help fix. And so that's kind of a problem. And that's why I say before the 19th century, there was no real formal juvenile justice system. But right on the cusp, right before we get into the 19th century, in the late 18th century and the early 19th century, in this transitional period, something happened in the world that changed everything. And that was the Enlightenment. And for those of you who don't know, the Enlightenment was an era of reason, individual rights, and values. So this dawn of reform, this idea that individuals have their rights and there is concepts of morality, of right and wrong, and everything is not as simple black and white as it used to be, and we're starting to think of deeper political, emotional, psychological things were changing now. And because of this, there was a large push that said, hey, children aren't mini adults. It was around this time that we started to realize that kids aren't just little adults. They're actually their own separate thing, and they're developing. We didn't have formalized, developmental theories of how kids work, but we were starting to understand that they aren't quite the same. And so we had to change how we policed, and we realized maybe we need to have some kind of oversight. And so we start to see formalized juvenile justice come into being. We start to see individuals who are creating homes and whatnot for juvenile delinquents and trying to help them. And one of the big things that happened as a result is the development of the House of Refuge. And the House of Refuge itself is essentially a early, not quite reformatory school, but it was a place of reform for any juvenile who was delinquent or could be delinquent. So, very specifically, the House of Refuge, the first House of Refuge in New York City, was founded around 1824, 1825. And their whole concept was they believed that juvenile delinquency was the result of poor upbringing, a lack of education, and bad influences. So, they saw at this time that any type of young individual who was not seen as an adult and functioning member of society that was getting into trouble was only because they had a poor upbringing, they didn't have education, and they had bad influences in their lives. So, the solution from the people in power was to remove the juveniles from that situation and place them in these House of Refuge, their institutions, where they're rehabilitated via strict discipline, education, and vocational training. So, from the outset, this doesn't sound too bad. We're saying, okay, these kids who are juvenile delinquents, they're delinquent because they lack education and they have bad influences and they're not being raised. So let's remove them from those bad situations and put them somewhere where they can get learning, they can get education, they can get training, and they can be disciplined. So they're going to have proper upbringing, right? This is great. This is like genius level. This is the solution. Not so. So, one big issue that modern times we look back and say this was a problem is that some juveniles were deemed at risk of being delinquent, so they were removed from households because of parental neglect, poverty, or association with a known criminal. Yes, you heard that right. Some of these kids that were put in this essentially early juvenile detention facility were because their parents neglected them, they lived in poverty, or they had associations with a known criminal. Essentially, kids could be taken away because their parents were poor and put into a house with juvenile delinquents. Do we think that solved the delinquency problem? No. It did not solve the delinquency problem. And actually, in fact, some issues of these homes were that the severity of the punishments were actually doing more harm than they were helping, because they were gathering people that weren't just juvenile delinquents, but also people who could be delinquent because their parents were neglecting them or they were in poverty, meant that there was a huge overcrowding problem, much like we still have today. We had an overcrowding problem, which led to bad conditions and poor welfare within the building. And honestly, because the House of Refuge was designed to be a one-size-fits-all approach to dealing with delinquency, we're just going to do strict discipline, education, and training. That didn't work for everyone. It was ignoring some of the reasons why they were there. And so historically we realized this doesn't work. And unfortunately, this was a pretty common thing throughout the 1800s, so through the 19th century. And actually, one of the things that is kind of fun and weird and sad all at the same time is to realize that the Juvenile Court Act of 1899. Think about that for just a second. We are in the year 2025. And the Juvenile Court Act of 1899 started in Chicago, Illinois. And it was this philosophy that juvenile offenders needed guidance, education, and support rather than punishment. Led to some major changes happening in the United States and eventually the world over. And that was the big one, the development of a juvenile court. So yes, it wasn't until almost 1900 that a juvenile court existed. Think about that for just a second. When we talk about courts and everything, we can think back to like 1600s and be like, yeah, I can see that. I can see a court, 1700s, 1600s, 1400s. Like, a court has been around forever. Juvenile court, a court just for kids who are causing problems, is only since 1900. That's ridiculously recent in terms of the large history of justice. So, they developed a juvenile court. Also around this time was where they started to take a term policy from older Latin, which was the philosophy of parens patriae. It became popular in this new system because not only do we have a juvenile court, but we're also pushing for a more rehabilitation and a more parental role. And so literally, parens patriae, the government acts as the guardian for the youth. It's actually, it was used in older English times as the king is the parent to all the children of its land. So it was the duty and role of the government to take care of the children. So it came back at this time saying, hey, we have problems. Our court system doesn't treat kids the way it should, and the government should be acting in their best interest. So in 1899, a group of individuals in Chicago, Illinois put forward this idea, and it stuck. It really did. And this became the big primary piece of juvenile justice across the nation and later the world. Please note, I put this in italics. We will come back to this act in the future. That is the biggest hint I can tell you that the Juvenile Court Act of 1899 is going to show up on an exam. This is one of the few things that I'm going to ask you to remember, is the Juvenile Court Act of 1899. In next week's lecture, we'll talk about it again. It'll keep coming back up. This is a key date. This is a key moment for juvenile justice. So, after our... Sorry. There's one more thing I want to say about Juvenile Court Act today. I have it written down in my notes and I forgot to say it. So very specifically, the part of parens patriae, the government acts as guardians for the youth, it's more than just that. One thing that came directly from this is that they need to approach each case uniquely. And that means that we are starting to consider the individual needs of the juvenile versus the one-size-fits-all approach. I knew there was something I was missing. Okay, so now we're getting into more modern history, because like I said, that was 1899, so this was right at the end of the 19th century. So by the mid-20th century, so about the 1940s, 1950s, we started to see reform beginning. And specifically, we saw the expansion of community-based programs, specialized services for underlying issues, and things like that. So we were looking at problems that cause delinquency, like substance abuse and emotional dysfunction, family dysfunction. And I asked the question, why? And in an in-person class, I'd sit and wait for you to answer me and tell me, why do you think by the mid-20th century we had reform? And for those of you who are very familiar with history, especially American history and world history, you should know that around the early to mid 20th century, we saw a big boom in psychology and sociology. These were areas of science that started to get new ideas, and emerging technologies in health and science were letting us experiment more and more and learn more about behavior, and be, in the 1940s and 50s all the way through the 70s, we see psychology taking off and doing a whole bunch of different things. That's why. That is why we started focusing on services for underlying issues, and we started doing more community-based programs, is because psychology was telling us there are problems with the brain and we need to address them differently. And social work and sociology was telling us, holy crap, people don't do well in punishment or in isolation. We need to put them in groups, and we need to identify what problems are caused by society and which ones are caused by individual factors. And it was changing the world. It really was. And honestly, it would stay pretty standard until about 1980s. And in the 1980s in the United States, we saw the rise of conservative politics. It's always been a back and forth in this country, and the 1980s and 90s were a prime time of this kind of the beginnings of what we would call the extreme conservatism versus liberalism in this country. And so in the 80s and 90s, we had the tough on crime era. And this is a thing that you can look at. There's a historical thing on this, and it's specifically the rising crime rates and public fear in America at this time led to pushback from or pushback towards senators, politicians, etc., saying we need to get these criminals off the street. And there's a complicated history behind this. We're not diving into it in this class. Well, not at this point. We'll dive into it a little bit later. But because of the high rising crime rates and the way the general public was fearful of crime, it pushed the justice system as a whole to be stricter with enforcement and giving harsher punishments. This is why we still see people in prison for drug crimes from the 1980s. This was the time where we were tough on crime. This is one of those things where you can follow and trace it back. It's really weird. But so during this time, the 80s and 90s, is when we start to see 3-strike laws and zero tolerance policies start to come out. If you aren't familiar, this is fun fact. This is not something that would show up on an exam or a quiz, but I'm telling you it anyway. A 3-strike law is exactly what it sounds like. It is the escalation of crimes that are committed, where you have 3 strikes. If you commit you break the law, you get 1 strike. You break another one, it's a 2nd strike. You break the same one again, it's a 2nd strike. And the 3rd time, even if they were just minor things that you wouldn't have gotten necessarily prison time for, now you can get sentenced because you broke the law 3 times. 3 strikes, you're out. That's that kind of general policy. And then zero tolerance policies is exactly what it sounds like. And if you went to school anytime between the late 90s or mid 90s to the 2000s, heck, even the 2010s, you're probably familiar with a zero tolerance policy. And it literally means it does not matter the severity of the thing. If you break the rule that's related to the zero tolerance policy, you get punished. Full stop. And that was solid for a good 20 years. But then the post-2000 world, the 21st century came in. And I can honestly tell you there was a pushback towards reform and rehabilitation. Please remember, juvenile justice as a whole, his primary focus has been rehabilitation for almost its entire existence. Minus a couple times where it got a little strict and tough, the goal has always been on rehabilitation. So while our larger justice system sometimes gets focused on punishment, juvenile justice has tried to remain as non-punitive as possible. So, that being said, that's our brief little history breakdown. But I want to talk about three things in particular because they are important, and that's relation to the influence on changes in criminal justice. And again, this is not just juvenile justice, this is criminal justice as a whole. The justice system itself is oftentimes slow to change and slow to update. This frustrates some people, and I understand why, but it's important to note that it is slow to change. However, it does make changes oftentimes based on one of three, if not all three, of these particular functions. It's the social attitudes, the economic conditions, and the political climate. So, I don't think I need to explain these deeply, but I will go over it anyway. So one of the influences on change in criminal justice is social attitudes. Social attitudes are the way the general public, the local population, the people, it's the way that they view issues. It's the way they feel about things. It's why in the 80s and 90s they wanted to be tough on crime. And we became tough on crime. Social attitudes led to that change. The power of the people is surprisingly powerful. Never forget that. A second component that oftentimes is very influential is the political climate. And you don't need to look any further than our current political climate. Currently, our political climate is very harsh on immigration and is dealing with a lot of that. And if you pay attention, there are policies that are being put forward that have to do with immigration, because the political climate oftentimes also majorly influences criminal justice. So social attitudes and political climate are two things that are people-based that influence criminal justice. But I can honestly tell you the third one is just as important, and it is connected to people, but it's more than people, and that's the economic conditions. If our country is economically booming, like we have an excess, we are doing super well financially, it's going to impact what type of laws are being enforced, what type of things we're doing, what policies are being put forward. If the economic conditions are really bad, we're going to see a change in the type of crimes that they are punishing, that they are pursuing. We're going to see changes on the type of policies and laws that are put in place. That's why I say these are the three major influences on criminal justice in regards to change. Okay. So, punishment versus rehabilitation. We've talked about rehabilitation and punishment not as a concept yet, but we've explained, or rather I've said, that the primary purpose of juvenile justice is rehabilitation, not punishment. So we really need to explain what the heck is the difference? What am I even talking about? Mr. Wheaton, what do you mean when you say rehabilitation versus punishment? And to that I say, well, simply this. Rehabilitation believes in looking at the influences and moving towards changing behaviors via social programs. In other words, rehabilitation wants you to become a fully functioning member of society once again. Full stop. Punishment, as a concept, believes in literally punishing behavior in an effort to lower the crime rate through fear and to protect society at large. So note, rehabilitation is about making you a functioning member of society again. Punishment is about stopping criminal behavior and protecting society. Both are noble goals, both are important, but they are distinctly different. And so it's important, it is very important that we know the difference between rehabilitation and punishment. because juvenile justice as a whole, as a concept, its goal is rehabilitation. The adult criminal justice system, in part, is punishment and in part rehabilitation. This one's definitely connected to the influences because, well, we tend to be more punitive in the arresting function, in the police functions, and in some states, in some areas, our corrections are more rehabilitative. It's complicated. If you want to know more about it, take the other criminal justice classes, not just juvenile justice. But if you've had me for Intro to Criminal Justice before, I've used this term in that class, and I use it here because I think it's important for us to remember. The pendulum is always swinging. Criminal justice as a whole. That's why I said both of these were noble pursuits and important. The goal of criminal justice is to find the perfect balance between rehabilitation and punishment. Because we know going too far on one end or the other tends to not work. There are problems with it. So we try to find an equal balance. And oftentimes we swing too far in one direction or the other. So, the pendulum is always swinging. Right now, we are still in the rehabilitation, but I would argue we have pushes that are trying to bring us back towards punishment. What that'll look like in 10 years, I don't know. But it is important to note that this is something that is changing. And it seems weird to say that, but it's true. Things like business and science and whatnot are always changing. Criminal justice is always changing as well. It's a living system. It doesn't stay the same for its entire existence. So you have to be ready to accept that it's going to look different. So, sorry, I'm just looking at something. Okay, we're good. So, I want to talk about, because again, this is the just overview of juvenile justice. I want to talk about current trends and future directions, because it is important to note that, things have changed, and things that are currently happening now might not be the same, again, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, heck, even a year from now. It's hard to tell. But for the most part, some of the current things that we have are restorative justice circles. We'll talk about restorative justice here, actually, I want to say in 6 weeks, 7 weeks, something like that. It's one of the later things we talk about. But restorative justice circles are all about, bringing the victims of crime and the people who commit crimes together and try to restore what has been lost, what has been damaged. It's kind of the whole point of it. And so this is something that we are doing in juvenile justice now. We're trying more and more restorative justice circles. We're also doing diversion programs. And diversion programs are exactly what they sound like, but if you're not familiar with criminal justice, it might be a weird concept for you to consider. But diversion programs are literally taking them out of the formal system, stopping them from, being involved in criminal activity. We do diversion programs to stop kids from being put into the system formally. We stop them from, going to juvenile detention. We put them in a different program, something that they need rather than just to punish them. Another thing that's really big right now that is a current trend, and I would argue is something that the future directions is also still doing. And I can say this as somebody who's had a recent committee of people in the criminal justice field here in Erie County in Pennsylvania talking about this. And trauma-informed care is actually a big deal right now. And again, not just at the juvenile level, at all levels, adult level, everything. Trauma-informed care is something that, because of psychology, we understand a lot more about it. And so this is a big push right now. And I would argue that for the foreseeable future, this is something that we are trying to do because we are learning through psychology and through these that a lot of people commit crimes because it is a trauma response to something that's been unaddressed. So trauma-informed care is trying to stop criminal behavior through understanding trauma and being able to help correct the behavior without, punishing. It's a real important aspect. So we're seeing it start now, but this is definitely a direction for the future of juvenile justice, is we're trying to get more and more community involvement. Less formalized juvenile detention facilities and more community service, more community outreach, more of these types of programs. So that is a very big future direction and current trend. And of course, all of this is, needs to be said that policy changes. As things happen, as we get people in political power changing, it's important to note that policy changes are going to happen. We have them obviously at the state level, but we'll also have them at the federal level. And so policy changes are always something to keep an eye on. It's harder to talk about in a generic sense because, it changes and it depends on who's in charge and what they want to focus on. So what we do know with policy changes is there is more of a push for mental health treatment and community services and education programs, at least currently. So, all right. So, if I were to ask you to give me 3 key principles of juvenile justice, I would argue that you could simply say fairness, due process, and to uphold dignity, and I would say that that's a valid answer. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. See, there's a bonus and benefit to listening to my lectures, is I can sometimes give you hints on what questions might be on a quiz or an exam. But yes, so juvenile justice itself does hold itself to 3 principles: fairness, due process, and uphold dignity. And I just want to check real quick. Yeah. We're going to talk about uphold dignity in its own slide. Okay, so fairness is about the conversation of equality and equity. And this is where I say, do you know the difference between equitable and equal? Because they're not the same. They're 2 components of similar idea that are important, but they are not the same thing. Equality means that everyone is given the same access, the same rights. Whether you're rich or poor, black or white, practice one religion or the other, you're 6 foot tall or 5 foot tall. None of that matters. You all get the same resources. That's equal. Equitable is, the rich person doesn't need necessarily all the same access as the person who's poor because the poor person can't afford it and the rich person can. Equitable means that the poor person gets more because they can't afford it, whereas the rich person can. Fairness is about finding the balance between equity and equal. Because if we do only one, there's an imbalance and there's a lack of, quote, fairness. Fairness is finding the balance between equality and equity. Due process is legal rights. Full stop. That's all you need to know is full rights at this point. Due process is the rights that you are given as an individual. And we'll talk about it later in this class in a different lecture, but juveniles still have legal rights. Just because they're not adults doesn't mean they don't have constitutional rights. And just because they're a juvenile doesn't mean that they get or just because they're a citizen of the United States means they get every right, because that's not true either. It's complicated, and we'll talk about it. But in case you're wondering, some rights are things like the right to a timely hearing, right to be notified of their crimes, right to an attorney, right to confront their accuser. That's due process. Like I said, we'll talk more about this later, trust me. And then the 3rd principle of juvenile justice is to uphold dignity. And what this means is that we recognize an individual's worth and their rights. It's not just that they have rights, but that we give them those rights. We recognize their worth. We notice that they have potential. They're not worthless. They are not something that we should ignore. And another part of this uphold dignity is supporting the mental and emotional well-being. And I argue we should do this for everyone, not just juveniles, but it is important to note that we should be supporting each other. And so what strategies do we use to uphold dignity? Because it's kind of hard and it's kind of vague the way it's phrased. So this looks like respectful treatments, not treating them inappropriately with cruel or unusual punishment or belittling them, berating them, but respectful treatment. And something that seems very weird to say but important to say is age-appropriate care and services. If an 8-year-old is in trouble, are you going to treat them the same way you would treat a 17-year-old? I would hope not. There's a different level of maturity there that you need to address. And so, to uphold dignity, we have to consider what is age appropriate. We also want to give the juvenile who's committed the crime, we want to give them participation and voice in their sentencing and in how they recover. Not that they get to say, oh, I shouldn't be punished. No, there's obviously that's not going to work, but making them an active participant actually has a surprisingly beneficial impact. And we'll talk about that later in this class as well. We want to make sure that family and community connections are supported. We don't want to isolate juveniles. We actually find that by isolating them, we do more damage. We want to remember they have potential for growth and development and that they have an inherent capacity for change. It's one of those, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Let's be honest. The older somebody gets, the less likely they are willing to change. This is an unfortunate reality of human beings. Not everyone, but a good portion. But kids tend to have a very big possibility of change. They're easy to adapt. So we need to remember that. And perhaps one of the more important things is education. We're going to talk about this so much you're going to hate it. Education is proven to be one of the most important aspects of proper rehabilitation of juvenile offenders, of any offender for that matter, is education. And it doesn't just mean traditional, like, school education. It means vocational training. It means things like therapy to work on emotional regulation. It's any of that stuff. So, perhaps one of the more important things that I want to say before we dive into the role of the community, I guess I should go back one slide for the upholding dignity. We need to remember that for rehabilitation, we want to emphasize restorative justice and reintegration. We want to balance accountability and support. Okay. So let's talk about the role of the community. And so truly, the community is important to proper rehabilitation because the right nurturing environment will support growth and development. Full stop. Okay? So we also have to talk about community-based programs. And the goal of most community-based programs is to address the underlying issues of delinquency. Because one thing that we do know from research is that delinquency does not happen in a vacuum. There are reasons, there are influences. And so we want to find the underlying issue that led to this behavior. And so oftentimes these programs focus on surprisingly very easy things. They're things like mentorship and counseling. We have found that by having peer mentorship or even having adult mentors helping guide children actually have a positive impact on their behavior. It's why programs like the Big Brother, Big Sister program actually has supportive data that says this does work. And also counseling. Just having regular counseling is helpful, especially for juveniles who don't have a healthy outlet. By being able to receive counseling and help and guidance, they can find positive ways to let out those emotional issues without committing a crime. Like I said, education. You're going to hate it, but education and vocational training, absolutely one of those key components. We know that education leads to less criminal behavior. Another thing that a lot of community-based programs like to focus on is engaging offenders, victims, and the communities in dialogues and activities to repair harm. This is Restorative Justice 101. You want to make sure that it's not happening in a vacuum. You want all of these people to be involved because then positive growth happens. And one of the more serious things that we tend not to talk about too much is addiction treatment and mental health treatment. Kids can be addicted. They can be addicted to everything that an adult can be addicted to, even if they're not supposed to have access to it. So addiction treatment is really important, as well as mental health treatment, because kids are still growing and they're susceptible to a lot of things. So it's important that they have that kind of treatment available to help them before they commit a crime or future crime. And one of the most important things that the community does is they act as a support system. And support systems are very important. There's obvious things like family, church, school, etc. But social workers are part of the community too. Mentors are part of the community. The whole point of a support system is to make sure that they are not alone, that if they need help, there is somebody there to help guide them, to help be the rock, the shoulder, the whatever they need for support. And please note, I didn't go deeper into on family or school because we're going to talk about them in separate videos because they are important enough that they have whole sections of lecture dedicated to them. But it's important to note today, the family must be involved and want to help for it to be a positive influence on rehabilitation. And schools need to understand their role and the impact they have on juvenile delinquency. Like I said, we'll talk way more about both of those in later weeks, but I wanted to get those out of the way today. And that wraps up this first lecture video. So thank you very much for listening. I know it's probably a little bit shorter than I probably anticipated, but I want to let you know, this is the first lecture video. This is a brief overview of the whole system. Each week there will be a video like this, and during this end part, I'll go over assignments. This week there's nothing, so enjoy. Read Chapter 2 so that you're ready for next week's lecture. And yeah, there'll be a quiz next week on Chapters 1 and 2. That being said, thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.